The hypocrisy of deifying ego, a critique of some atheist paradigms. Atheism, at its core, is a rejection of theistic beliefs, particularly the notion of an omnipotent, omniscient, and eternal creator God. Atheists often pride themselves on skepticism, reason, and evidence-based beliefs, rejecting what they see as irrational faith in supernatural entities. However, in their critique of religious dogma, some atheists may unwittingly fall into the same patterns of deification they reject, except their deity is not a god in the traditional sense, but the ego. This essay explores the hypocrisy of such atheistic perspectives by demonstrating the parallels between religious worship of God and the implicit worship of the ego, highlighting the lack of evidence for either entity and the consequences of this psychological projection. The ego as a psychological construct. Ego, in the context of this discussion, refers not to Freud's technical concept, but to the broader culturally ingrained notion of the self as a distinct, autonomous, and central entity. Modern neuroscience and psychology increasingly suggest that this sense of self is an emergent property of the brain, constructed through a series of neural processes rather than a concrete, enduring I that exists independently of the body. The Buddha, over 2 millennia ago, articulated this idea through the concept of anatta, or non-self, arguing that the self is a transient aggregation of mental and physical components. Modern science corroborates this view, showing that the brain's sense of self is malleable and context-dependent, with no unchanging core. The ego, then, is less a fact of existence and more a useful fiction, one that helps humans navigate their social and physical environments. Atheists' rejection of God. Atheists critique the God hypothesis on several grounds. 1. Lack of empirical evidence. There is no empirical evidence for an omnipotent, eternal creator. Theistic claims are often non-falsifiable, making them scientifically meaningless. 2. Psychological projection. Many atheists argue that God is a human invention, a psychological projection of our desires for order, justice, and immortality onto the cosmos. 3. Fallacies in theology. Atheists point to logical inconsistencies in the concept of God, such as the problem of evil or the paradoxes inherent in omniscience and omnipotence. These critiques are valid and often compelling. However, when some atheists reject God, they may unconsciously replace this deity with another, the ego. The deification of ego. While atheists reject the notion of an eternal, omnipotent God, many simultaneously elevate their sense of self, the ego, to a similarly divine status. They might not kneel in worship, but their behavior and worldview suggest that they place ultimate value and authority in their personal identity, desires, and intellect. This deification of the ego manifests in several ways. 1. Supremacy of rationality. Many atheists view their rational minds as the ultimate arbiter of truth, implicitly elevating their subjective reasoning to an infallible level. 2. Individualism as sacred. In rejecting religious community and shared rituals, some atheists embrace radical individualism, centering their lives around the ego's wants and preferences. 3. Moral autonomy. By dismissing divine commandments, some atheists assert that their moral compass originates solely from within, often treating their subjective morality as universally valid. Ego as a projection. Ironically, the atheists' critique of God as a projection of human ego onto the universe can also be applied to their own egocentric worldview. The God they reject, a supreme being who imposes order and meaning, is replaced by the self, which now assumes the role of meaning maker. The self becomes a smaller, internalized version of God, e-God, if you will. This shift does not eliminate the problem of projection, but merely relocates it. The lack of evidence for ego. If atheists reject God on the grounds of lacking evidence, they must also confront the similarly tenuous evidence for the ego. Neuroscientific research demonstrates that the sense of self is an illusion crafted by the brain. Studies on split brain patients, for example, show that what we perceive as a unified self is actually the result of disconnected processes. Similarly, meditation and mindfulness practices reveal that the self can dissolve under scrutiny, leaving only a flow of thoughts, sensations, and experiences without a central I. The evidence undermines the atheist ego deification hypothesis just as much as it undermines theistic claims. To reject God for lacking evidence while clinging to the ego is to engage in the same cognitive dissonance that atheists often accuse theists of. The consequences of ego worship. The consequences of deifying the ego are strikingly similar to those of deifying God. 1. Dogmatism. Just as religious dogma can blind believers to alternative perspectives, egocentrism can lead atheists to dismiss ideas that challenge their worldview. This intellectual rigidity mirrors the very irrationality they decry in religion. 2. Moral absolutism. By elevating their personal morality to the status of universal truth, ego-worshipping atheists risk becoming moral absolutists, unwilling to acknowledge the cultural and contextual nature of ethical systems. 3. Conflict and division. The ego's need for validation and superiority fosters tribalism, which is no less divisive than religious sectarianism. A path beyond hypocrisy. To move beyond this hypocrisy, atheists must adopt a truly evidence-based worldview, one that applies skepticism and critical thinking to the ego as rigorously as it does to God. This requires 1. Humility, recognizing that the self is not the ultimate authority, but a construct among many. 2. Interconnectedness, embracing a view of existence that transcends individualism, acknowledging that humans are part of a vast, interdependent system. 3. Mindfulness, practicing awareness of the ego's illusions, as found in traditions like Buddhism, which align with scientific insights into the nature of self. By deconstructing the ego, atheists can achieve the same liberation they seek through their rejection of God. This deconstruction leads not to nihilism, but to a more profound sense of connection and purpose, grounded in the reality of interbeing rather than the illusion of a separate self. Conclusion. The critique of religious belief as irrational is often justified. Yet atheists who deify their egos fall into the same trap they condemn. The ego, like God, is a projection, a useful fiction without empirical basis. Recognizing this hypocrisy is not an attack on atheism itself, but an invitation to deepen its philosophical rigor. By dismantling the false idol of the ego, atheists can align more fully with the principles of evidence, reason, and humility they espouse. In doing so, they move closer to the truth they claim to seek, transcending the dualism of theism and atheism to embrace a more integrated understanding of existence. This essay points out that the ego, like God, lacks empirical evidence, and that some atheists, in rejecting one deity, may inadvertently create another. By acknowledging and addressing this hypocrisy, they can transcend both forms of dogma, achieving a more coherent and truthful worldview.